Hello, everyone. This is Neko Suave speaking. Have you ever gotten the urge to do something heinous in video games? Perhaps something evil? Okay, that's a stupid question. Of course you have. But what if I told you that there's a game where you do nothing but evil deeds? Get your evil costumes ready because it's time to talk about Overlord. Ah yes, Overlord. When I played this game for the first time, I was just getting into the fantasy genre. I played Elder Scrolls 4 and wanted another game like it. So at some point I came across this little gem for the Xbox 360. I remember having a great time with it, but I'm pretty sure I died a lot in the process. However, it's been almost 7 years since I beat this game, so I don't know if it holds up to this day. Before we get into the game proper, however, let's talk about its background. Overlord was a game made by Triumph Studios, a company founded in the Netherlands in 1997. Despite being around for almost 20 years at this point, their only other franchise is the Age of Wonder series, and combined with the Overlord games they've done, Triumph Studios has a grand total of 8 games under their belt. The game was first announced in 2006, and it was advertised as being set in a twisted fantasy world where players have the choice to be evil, or really evil. The story itself was full of black comedy, and often parodies the typical fantasy tropes. Although given some elements of it, the game could be considered a parody of a dark fantasy as well. Gameplay-wise, it combines aspects of real-time strategy and RPGs. While the first examples of it were shown at E3 2006, a demo wouldn't be released until June 2007, a few weeks before its release date on the 26th. It had a couple of things going for it. An ensemble cast of voice actors that, for the most part, had experience with voicing characters in video games, a composer that worked on the Age of Wonder soundtrack, and a somewhat successful writer in Rihanna Pratchett, who was a co-writer for Heavenly Sword. Judging by the scores, it appears it was a good game, but I wouldn't know. I never owned a PS3. Prices were insane back in 2007, guys. It probably helps that her father's a famous writer as well. It's in the name, do I need to say it? Now, the premise of the game is simple. You are an Overlord, a being in shining armor that's out to rule over the simple-minded masses. You control these creatures called minions. Not the ones that look like peeps, I mean these ones. They're closer to gremlins. And they look adorable. Anyway, with them by your side, you can wreak havoc upon the world around you. Or you can wreak more havoc. After all, your goal is to take over the world! So why not have some fun and wreck houses or kill peasants? Or maybe you want them to do their own thing and be repaid for your mercy later. It's up to you. Which brings us to this question. Is this game any good? Is it worth playing to get the rush of being an evil ruler? Or is it better off being left to rot in a spawning pit? Let's find out. So you begin this tale with a bunch of minions opening up a coffin where the Overlord is sleeping. Gnarl, the oldest of the bunch, tells you to go on an adventure and do the following. Get the lair fixed, get revenge on the heroes who killed the previous Overlord, and re-establish a dark domain over the land. One by one, you and your minions conquer the regions of... I don't know, you never get a name for the land you're taking over. Along the way, you encounter the heroes who have fallen down hard, each succumbing to one of the 7 deadly sins. The first hero you face, Melvin, has long succumbed to the sin of gluttony, and as such looks less like a halfling and more like a wrecking ball. The next hero, Oberon, succumbed to sloth, then William to lust, Goldo to greed, Jewel to envy, and Khan to wrath. The last of the heroes, simply known as the Wizard, got hit with the sin of pride. For a good reason, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Also throughout the story, you have to find minion hives so you can use the other types of minions. What, you thought those other holes were for decoration? Of course not. After all, one of them spawns literal hell spawn. When you get to Castle Spree, you meet up with Rose, who joins your company after you clear the place out. Provided you get her things first. After bringing in Her Royal Highness's matched luggage, you move on to Evernight. Once you're done there, you head for Heaven's Peak, and things start to get interesting. First off, William lets out these little bits of dialogue when you fight him.
You Didn't we leave you for dead in that god-forsaken tower? The wizard taught me how to seek my freedom. I won't let you take it, you uncouth lout! Never!
Then, after you kill him, you meet Velvet, and from there you have to pick between her and Rose. Coincidentally, the two are sisters. From there, the story doesn't give you any more clues. All you know is that the wizard is the main threat and is likely to have been the first to fall from grace. However, once you capture Jewel and defeat Khan, the game drops quite a few bombshells on you. First off, that wizard? Turns out he's actually the previous Overlord who hijacked his body. Second off, the wizard Overlord is about to take back the crown and robs you of your powers in the process. Third, Rose and Velvet are the wizard's two daughters, and whoever you dumped was the one who led him to the tower. And finally, it turns out there was an eighth hero among the other seven. Guess who that was? You. As you travel through the tower's depths, you learn that you and the heroes cornered the previous Overlord, and you sacrificed your life to stop him. And almost none of the heroes wanted to stick around to help you, except for Oberon. You know, it's probably around this time that you realize that these people were once your allies, possibly your friends, and you killed them all. But once you get all your powers back, it's final boss time.
The good always want to be heroes. They're so predictable. So evil.
Okay, if you don't know what to do, you might end up dying quickly. The wizard will surround himself in a color-coded barrier, and you have to counter by sending in the appropriate minions. The green barrier is probably the easiest to get through. After all, a bunch of backstabs on an old back, regardless of your magical abilities, isn't good for you. The red barrier, on the other hand, is the worst to deal with. Why? Because you need red minions to break it, and unless you have 12 or so, they are going to take forever. In fact, they may take so long that the wizard will get bored and move somewhere else. Halfway through, he'll surround you with corrupted minions and he'll break out a dangerous move. And by dangerous, I mean it's dangerous because you can't run. He surrounds himself in evil energy and spins around the arena. Kinda reminds me of...
Like a tornado!
Eventually, you succeed in killing him, officially overthrowing the old Overlord. From here, you'll get one of two endings, both depending on how high your corruption meter is. At 50% or less corruption, you get an ending where evil becomes a part of life. Peasants worshipping the Overlord, you and Rose sitting around while the minions relax, and at least one minion going out and getting together with a human female, creating miniature versions of himself. No, I don't know how that would work, nor do I want to know. At 51% or higher, however, you instead see chaos and destruction everywhere, with the Overlord and his minions emerging from a fire, Heaven's Peak becoming even more destroyed, and peasants getting tortured by both the Overlord and Velvet. But regardless of what ending you got, it'll end with the Jester, angry because you kicked him so many times, performing a ritual that sets the entire room ablaze. And so the story ends with the Jester's screams as he's swallowed by the flames. And it sounds like something out of someone's nightmares. Time to get into the individual bits of the game, starting with how it looks, because as we all know, graphics are the most important part of any video game. The backgrounds look decent, from the bright and tranquil mellow hills, to the dark and haunted Evernight Forest, to the weary and dank Heaven's Peak. They all let you know what you're in for, one way or another. Let's use Mellow Hills as an example. At the beginning of the game, it's always sunny, everything uses bright and earthy colors, and there's sheep everywhere. It seems like a safe haven at first, but as you enter halfling territory, the area gets a bit foggier, and you start seeing corpses of peasants littering the ground. And when you enter the halfling homes, you see dishes, piles of sludge, and food baskets all over the floor. A lot of the small things you notice throughout the areas you visit tie into the hero you'll be fighting there, and especially what sin they've been corrupted by. There's also the Overlords Tower, which starts off as a broken mess, but once you get a crane from the slave camps in your spree, you can get it fixed up. It'll look nice by the time you're back from rescuing Rose. From there, you can customize it using gold you've accumulated throughout your journey. Your options change depending on which mistress you end up keeping. Rose helps keep it a pristine place fit for a ruler, while Velvet makes it as dark and corrupted as you are. Even the skies above the tower change depending on your corruption level. They look normal at 0%, but as you grow more corrupt, they take on a red hue. At 100%, they look like something I'd expect on Dark Aether. At least there's nothing like the ing in this game. But while I enjoy the backgrounds, I can't say the same for the character models. I'll get the ones I like out of the way first. The Overlord looks decent, but that's likely because he's always wearing his armor. At least the armor actually looks like armor, instead of something that looks like plastic or something. If you haven't been corrupted, the Overlord would look more like a knight in shining armor, which is fine, considering that in that case, he's more like an anti-villain than anything else. Should you go down the corrupt path, however, not only will your armor get darker, but you'll also have spikes growing out of it. They look decent enough, until you're around 80% corruption where they look flat out ridiculous. Oh, and the spikes aren't even around in the corrupt ending. The minions, for the most part, look okay. They look like what you'd expect them to. For example, the water-dwelling blue minions look like a cross between a fish and an imp. However, sooner or later, you're going to realize that only the brown minions are allowed to wear hats. I can understand why the red minions can't have hats, but what about the blues and the greens? They don't really have anything on their heads that could keep a hat from fitting. Why don't they have hats? Lastly, there's the mistresses, who look okay to me. I would say they each represent a different side of evil pretty well. Now for the rest. The peasants look, well, ugly. They look like the stereotypical British person with their messed up teeth. Maybe it was intentional, what with it being a parody and all, but just because it was done on purpose doesn't mean I have to like it. The bosses look somewhat better, but not much. Out of all of them, I'd say Jewel looks the worst, for one reason. She looks awful when you get a close-up of her. Ugh. You're likely not going to remember the monster designs because you're too busy swarming them with minions to pay attention. The ones I could recall were either ones I fought a lot for one reason or another, the ones that aren't swarmed all the time, or ones that can only be defeated in specific ways. And even then, they all looked average at best. But I've yet to get to the worst offender. Gnarl. When you see him in the opening cutscene, he has one glowing eye, and the other eye looks either swollen or damaged to the point where it can hardly be used. Looked pretty cool to me. But then you see him in the game proper, and he looks like your average minion, but with gray skin. And when he talks to the wizard at the end of the game, ugh. What happened? Could they not make his in-game model look like the cutscenes? Then again, a different company handled the opening, so that might have to do with it. Now, I know me complaining about Gnarl's appearance might sound nitpicky, but consistency is important, even in one's appearance. Overall, the graphics are a bit of a mixed bag. Sure, the Overlord mistresses and minions look good, and the backgrounds look pretty great, but everything else looks average at best and pretty bad at worst. Again, this might have been done on purpose since it's a parody, but I'm not exactly laughing over their appearances. Right off the bat, we're off to a good start with the soundtrack. Each track is varied enough to keep you from thinking everything sounds too similar. For example, the music you'd hear at Golden Hills takes advantage of the horns, with the music in the Dwarven villages sounding like a march. Meanwhile, the Evernight soundtrack has a mysterious vibe to it, especially the track you hear when you start encountering the nightmares. By the way, this track helped me tolerate this section of the game. Really, I hated having to deal with those skull rats every time I walked by, which I did often because Oberon and his tree are in the area immediately after them. Annoying little pests. Sometimes, depending on your corruption level, the music can change. The only areas where I truly noticed this were Spree and the Tower. The Tower's theme, when pure, switches between a dungeon-esque theme and Rose's theme. But when you're corrupt, you get a sense of foreboding with the music that plays. And the theme that plays when you go up to Velvet's quarters just oozes decadent evil. The voice acting, for the most part, is pretty good. Most of the voice actors had experience prior to this game, and it shows. A lot of the characters sound really well done.
You brought me a gift. Some little pixies. You really shouldn't have.
However, there are two that stand out and not in a good way. Oberon was voiced by Mason B. Fisher, and this is his only acting credit. Same goes for Jules actress Melissa Monzo. Neither of them sound good, with their lines sounding forced at times.
It's gone! The statue's gone! I told you lot to hurry up! Fools!
We must help him. He fought beside us. There may still be a chance.
At least Fisher's got some composing credits. Better than doing nothing before or after Overlord, right? So overall, the audio's pretty good, with a few hiccups here and there when it comes to the voice actors. Let's start with the game mechanics. As mentioned earlier, the gameplay takes elements of strategy and role-playing games, all while you take control of the Overlord in a third-person view. Now, considering how you control minions, I don't think this would have worked well in first person, so they made a good call keeping the camera behind the Overlord. By moving the mouse around, you can move the camera, though you're usually better off keeping it behind you. Combat is simple. You attack by hitting the space key. That's about it. You can use the spells, but I've hardly found any use for them, except the fire spells. And the higher tier ones use up a lot of mana at a time, which may be a problem depending on whether or not you've collected the mana totems. Also, you can't run. I guess there's a law somewhere stating that overlords must walk like badasses at all times. The game's strategy elements involve your minions. A good chunk of combat involves using them to take down your enemies. You can either try playing it safe and figure out how to take care of obstacles, or attempt to brute force your way through. Both methods can work in any given situation, though the latter is more likely to kill your minions. Why? Each minion has their own strengths and weaknesses that you have to pay attention to. Browns can take the most damage before dying, reds are best at long-range combat and are rather squishy, greens, when placed on a marker, can go invisible and can backstab enemies, dealing massive damage, and blues can go through water and heal fallen minions, provided you get to them in time, but are very weak at fighting. Failing to account for those can result in your entire horde being wiped out, which can potentially lead to your death. It is possible to defeat enemies and even bosses without your minions, but it's difficult and more time-consuming to do so. Then there's the RPG elements. First off, there's the ways you get stronger, such as collecting smelters so you can build better armor, and collecting the health, mana, and minion totems scattered about the land. Speaking of the minions, even they have a bit of an RPG element infused into them, since each type can fall into a certain archetype. Browns are the warriors, reds are the archers, greens are the assassins, and blues are the mages. Considering each minion's pros and cons, these make sense, though the browns are clearly better because they can wear hats. Finally, there's that corruption meter I've mentioned a lot but haven't really talked about. There are various actions you can do throughout the game that'll either increase or decrease your corruption level. These include certain actions you can do around the time you're expected to fight the boss of any given area. Most of them involve doing some rather heinous things, such as burning down the elves' sacred grove, damning them to extinction over some gold, keeping velvet, etc. Though oddly enough, it doesn't seem to impact gameplay all that much. All it does is make people afraid of you and change your appearance. You lied to me, Gnarl! Although I shouldn't be surprised, since you're an evil little bastard. Now, for some odd reason, the game doesn't tell you all of the controls. Sure, you're told the basics during the tutorial, like how to attack and move your minions about, but you're not told about how markers work or how to switch spells. While they do eventually tell you how to place markers shortly after you get your reds, you'd think they'd tell you during the tutorial, I had to look up how to switch spells. Guess which buttons they are? The F buttons. One of which takes screenshots on Steam. At least you'll take a screenshot every time you use your strongest domination spell. Thankfully, you can change the controls, but it's still odd that these are the default controls for spell switching. Other than that, though, there's nothing really wrong with how the Overlord himself controls. However, I can't say the same about the minions. You can either get them to rush forward by holding down the left mouse button, or you can hold down both mouse buttons and move the mouse around to control the horde directly. To call them back, you hold down the right mouse button. However, this doesn't always work, as the minions will sometimes ignore your attempts to call them back, usually when they're fighting an enemy. And if you let go of the mouse buttons at all, then try to sweep them again, the minions will not move, forcing you to call them back and try again. This can lead to some bad situations, like when you're trying to sweep your blues through a geyser puzzle in the moist caverns. As for glitches, the only noteworthy one I came across happened when I was trying to make some durium armor. The cutscene that would normally play out ended after a few browns got in the smelter, so I guess it saved a few of my minions from a fiery death? Okay. So the gameplay is good if a bit simplistic, but the controls are a bit of a mixed bag. The controls for the Overlord are fine, if a bit confusing when it comes to spells, but the minions don't control that well. One of my favorite reviewers once said that there are two important things to a story: character development and plot. These are what the last two sections will cover, starting with the characters and what they develop into by the end of the game. The main character, the Overlord, begins as a man that is next in line to conquer the land. He's told what to do by Gnarl and kills off the heroes one by one. Sorta like a puppet, if you will. However, a game changer happens at the end when the wizard reveals that he was once a hero. It kinda throws his entire journey into question. This whole time, he was going around with no memory of who he was or why he woke up in a tomb. Instead of trying to find his identity, he's complacent enough to follow Gnarl's orders. Does that say anything about who he used to be? Did he ever realize that he had no memory of what happened before he was found? Did he assume that he must be the Overlord because these creatures that found him are calling him Master? We never really find out, and it's a bit of a shame. Seeing the Overlord react to his past in a way beyond mere indifference would have been great, but instead we just kill the wizard and that's about it. Maybe he was right all along.
The good. They don't know how close to evil they really are.
The other half of the Overlord's development is ultimately in your hands, namely in whether or not you choose to perform corrupt actions. I do like games where you have the freedom to go on whichever path you choose, and I appreciate the options you have in this game, but it still leaves me yearning for some more development for him. And unfortunately, the rest of the characters hardly get any development at all. The one thing Gnarl develops is a fondness for you, because after he betrays you for the old Overlord, he says he'll gladly take you back if you defeat his old master. And the mistresses, well, they don't really do anything once you bring them back to the tower, aside from commentate on your purchases, and either fight with or against you during the final moments of the game. But I'll give those three this: they're likable at least. Gnarl's a bit of a ham, and both Rose and Velvet have some pretty good wit about them. Characters having likable qualities is important, and unfortunately, aside from a few exceptions, I didn't like the rest of the cast that much. Most of the fallen heroes are such assholes, I feel apathetic about them at best, and I want to kill them at worst. The only ones I kinda liked were Oberon, Khan, and the Wizard. The bad thing that Oberon did was that he grew tired of fighting, which as a result led to the elven race being thrown in jeopardy after the dwarves ransacked Evernight. And it also led to Oberon being stuck in a huge tree. But unlike the rest of the fallen heroes, when Oberon wakes up, he has remorse for his actions and vows not to desert his race again. Unfortunately, since he blocks the path to Golden Hills, yeah. As for Khan, he doesn't do much aside from get angry and smash stuff. But oh boy, once you capture Jewel, he proceeds to go on a rampage through every single city you've conquered, just so he can get your attention, so he can destroy you. He may be angry at everything, but God help you if you hurt his Jewel. And then there's the Wizard, that magnificent bastard. He put a lot of thought in his plan, I mean really. First, he managed to possess the old wizard's body before he died. Then he corrupts all the other heroes while his replacements slept. Once you wake up, you end up killing the heroes, leaving nothing to stop him from taking back his throne. Had it not been for you having your own plans, it's possible that he would have won in the end. But he's only part of a small handful of likable characters, and the cast overall hardly gets any development. Now, considering that this is a parody of the dark fantasy genre, there's two things I already expect: comedy and dark fantasy tropes. I'll start with the dark fantasy bits. An element you usually see in dark fantasy stories is corruption, and this game has plenty of it. The 7 heroes, once protectors of the land, end up being turned evil, or at least into an antagonistic force, courtesy of the possessed wizard. And even before their corruption, their morality seems to be in the gray area at best, since most of them decide it's better to leave than to save the 8th hero. Another thing that's sometimes seen in dark fantasy tales is a cult, and the game has a straightforward example in the hedonistic Red Dawn. There's also the Silent Order, which looks like a parody of cults due to them taking their name very seriously. As for the world this game takes place in, there's plenty going wrong with it. Heaven's Peak has a plague problem, which turns the infected into mindless zombies, while Mellow Hills has an issue with the peasants being taken by halflings to be used as slaves. And that's not getting into what Goldo did to the elves. Long story short, he nearly drove them to extinction because he wanted the Golden Evernight. Meanwhile, Oberon has a tree boring into his head and bringing his nightmares to life, and all of the elves you find there are ghosts, while the ones that are still alive are slaving away in Golden Hills. Yep, I'd say this game's definitely a dark fantasy, but is it funny? I mean, surely it twists some of the tropes to comedic effect, right? Well, sort of. Arguably, the funniest thing you can do is kick the jester every time you see him. He could be in the middle of a phrase, and what do you give him? A boot to the head. Every single time. It's the gift that keeps on giving. I mentioned earlier that Gnarl's a little bit of a ham, and the delivery of his lines helps make him a bit funny.
In fact, I think I need to find a dark corner and something to pummel. 15! That's double the number of brain cells in the average sheep. This spell will slow down advancing enemies, giving you more time to make them very dead.
And some of the messages you get when you do corrupt actions have a bit of a sarcastic tinge to them. Like this one that pops up when you take the Mother Goddess statue for yourself. A bit, huh? But besides those, I didn't really laugh at the game's humor. If the peasant's stupidity is meant to be humorous, I know I didn't find it funny. Then again, I usually tend to be rather meh towards stupid characters, unless they're stupid and have no redeeming qualities. Then I get really annoyed and want them to go away. There's also a part in the game where the elven ghosts and Evernight start being melodramatic about their plight, to the point where Rose and Gnarl ridicule them for it. I saw that as more of a coping mechanism. They're stuck as ghosts and they can't do anything to save their home. Maybe they thought that by whining about it they could get someone to help them. It's not a good way to do it, but it's better than floating around doing nothing. Thankfully, the plot moves in a coherent fashion. As I'm sure everyone who's taken an English class has heard of by now, every story tends to follow a 5-point structure: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. It's easy to figure out what parts of the story go where. The tutorials, the exposition, the Overlord's rise to power and him defeating the corrupted heroes is the rising action, and the fight with the wizard is the climax. After that, everything just slides on down as the ending serves as the falling action. But with the sequel hook, not everything is resolved at the end. I suppose that's where the Raising Hell expansion comes in. But that'll get its own review, seeing as it has its own story. So overall, the story is good. The plot is coherent, and you can definitely tell this is meant to be a parody of the dark fantasy genre. However, for me at least, the comedy tended to be hit or miss. Thankfully though, the story doesn't rely on its comedy to get by, so there's still something good to be had here, especially if you're a fan of the dark fantasy genre. The game can take a while to complete. If you're trying to get all the items, don't die often, and remember to grind in the dungeon, I would say it would take about 18 hours. Difficulty's about average at the beginning, and it'll stay like that if you collect all the totems and build better weapons and armor. If you don't, I would imagine it would get harder as you went through the story. After playing it again, I kind of realized it wasn't as good as I remembered. I mean, granted, I got a new appreciation for the score because of how good it was, and the premise is still fun. I mean, you're playing an evil overlord, what's not fun about it? But the characters hardly develop throughout the story, the minion controls are frustrating, and even though it's supposed to be a parody, I didn't find it that funny. Still, the game can be a fun experience, and who knows, maybe you'll get more of a laugh out of it than I did. If you want to play a game where you're this evil conqueror, or if you want to play a dark fantasy game, go ahead and give this one a try. But if you want an RPG-esque game that's more character-driven, you might want to look elsewhere.